I'm Rachel Herzing, Executive Director of the Center for Political Education, and this is CPE Study Hall. Through CPE Study Hall, the Center for Political Education talks with authors of materials we think can make our struggles more powerful about how these materials can be put to work by organizers and activists. Today, I'm talking with Hilary Moore and James Tracy, the authors of No Fascist USA, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and Lessons for Today's Movements. It was published this year by City Lights. Hilary is a political educator and author writing about anti-racism and social movements. Her work focuses on the far right, climate change, state structures, systems of oppression, as well as liberal and left forms of resistance. She teaches with generative somatics and is a member of the leadership team of SURGE, Standing Up for Racial Justice. James teaches in labor and community studies and is a labor organizer at City College, San Francisco. James is also a veteran of the fight for housing justice in the Bay Area. You may also recognize him as one of the co-authors of Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power, Community Organizing in Radical Times. That was published by Melville in 2011. And there's been a lot of conversation recently about the rise of white nationalism and authoritarianism, and a lot of people are very concerned about that. We're seeing effects of that in real time today, as we are seeing armed far-right activists monitoring the election, for instance. So I'm really, really excited to get into thinking about how we can put this book to work. So James and Hilary, welcome to CPE Study Hall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hilary, I'm going to begin with you. For somebody who may never heard of the book, what is No Fascist USA?
The No Fascist USA is a movement history book, and it's really story driven. So it's kind of rooted in people's lived stories, but it's also the story of the organization, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. And it kind of charts the organization's beginning in 1977, its rise, its chapters across the country, and also how it completed and how members moved on into other movements. But really what it's kind of doing is charting the last time in this country that white supremacists and white supremacist organizing was mobilized, galvanized, accelerated by a friendly face in the White House. And basically the last time there was massive white backlash to Black organizing and Black gains for political power, and what that was. And we often think of that history as further back, but this book is kind of locating it in a recent history. And so this group of white radicals, you know, not only challenging white supremacists, but really wholeheartedly, committedly supporting movements for self-determination, and the trials and tribulations of the contradictions of that work, things that they did really well, things that they didn't do so well. And yeah, the book really ends with like looking at that moment in history and then what's useful today for activists, organizers who are committed to anti-racism, anti-fascism, and anti-imperialism too.
Thank you for that. Can you say just a little bit more detail, one of you, what was the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee? What kind of, describe the organization a bit?
Take it away, Hilary.
Sure. So it was a chapter-based organization, like it ended up being that way, but it actually took a few different forms. It started off in New York and upstate New York. It spread to different chapters. It began when folks who were targeted by COINTELPRO in the aftermath of massive state repression, a lot of people, Black leaders especially, were incarcerated. And what was happening at that time in '77 was the Ku Klux Klan having more cultural purpose and cultural purchase, and having more strategies, and that included using positions in state institutions like prisons and policing to continue harassment and surveillance of Black leaders. And so a letter was put out saying like, there's Klan in upstate prisons, and we need outside support because there's no consequence for the fact that they are carrying forth a Ku Klux Klan agenda within a state institution. So that's kind of what spurred the organization. And then chapters started to emerge really based on relationships and what was needed on the ground. So there was 12 chapters across the country. The organization started in 77, it went till about 92, 93. At least that's the moment that we're looking at in the book. But of course, now there's chapters and new life to the organization. Yeah, and there is some really important shifts that the book charts out about, like working with different kinds of Black leadership, and for white folks who are navigating what is most useful for our role and where are we most effective, like some of the contradictions of that came out, or also a range of tactics that they used, you know, anything from, James is real good at telling the story because of the Chicago piece, but like, you know, with a bullhorn out of a car, kind of yelling at white people to get on board for self-determination, you know, some less effective tactics, and then also growing into being effective coalition organizers to mobilize a broad base against fascism, against racism. So the book kind of charts out like what works and what doesn't and why. Yeah.
Thanks for that. James, can you talk a little bit about who the book is for? When the two of you started writing this together, who did you have in mind to get it in their hands?
Well, there's several different possible audiences. All are welcome to read the book, of course. I think that we approach this from a position of wanting to have something for people who are being newly brought into anti-racist and anti-fascist activism to be able to reflect on one organization that took that on in the 1980s. As Hilary alluded to, oftentimes we study what happened in the 60s or the 30s or Reconstruction, but a lot of these struggles were happening in the heart of the Reagan era, and so had a much more distinct link between to what's going on today with what the rise of what we call the alt-right, but we refer to the far right mostly in our book. So that's certainly that's certainly one of the primary audiences, but you know, any person who's curious about social movement history, about different that predominantly white collaborators with Black and Brown liberation have made, and the challenges that they've had are all there. So and we hope that it reads well. We hope that also people who like good books will also read this book, even if they're not coming to it primarily from a political standpoint yet.
So Hilary, while No Fascist USA isn't an oral history kind of in the strictest sense, as you were just discussing, it's deeply informed by interviews with former members of the committee. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how being in conversation with these movement elders, you did nearly 50 interviews, I think, for the book. How did that process, how has that impacted your own political work? Or what kinds of lessons do you think are inside of that method for organizers and activists today?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important pieces of actually sitting down and asking questions and listening to people's stories who've been in the work for a very long time is just to get a sense of what does and doesn't change over time. And for people who are in movement and are, you know, have plans to put these practices into a lifetime of work, just a long-term perspective really fucking matters. To bring, like, we're always in an urgent moment. It can feel that way because that's history. That's the moment we're in. And then when you have someone's lifelong perspective, that gives you a chance to kind of right size your moment. Not to say that it's less important at all, but to know what you've been building on. So I think in particular of like the 2 or 3 times I had the chance, because honestly, it came through organizing. I was doing anti-racist workshops and political education work with a few different organizations in rural Arkansas. And it was right after the white supremacist rally at the Sacramento Capitol. And, you know, where 5 folks were stabbed, and I was trying to make sense of what that moment was. And a few of my mentors in Catalyst Project and otherwise were like, you know, you're going to be going to Arkansas next week. You need to talk to Trella Laughlin, who's not so far from where you're going to be in Dardanelle, Arkansas. Just go talk to her about it, because I was like scrambling for my own ability to make sense of what was going on. And just to be in the same room as someone who understood the political context, and then to see how they've made choices over time, how that changed me in my politics, and what I see is like a refining of commitment, and then also just knowing that how these politics live through someone and through decades, like when the political moment shifts, right? But how the principles and the politics kind of stay true and then adjust and pivot in these new political moments. So I don't know, those are some of my favorite moments and memories of even writing this book, is just actually having conversations with people who like me, were trying to make sense of what we're going through, and then based on their political compass and then the relationships they have in movement, you know, making the best decisions that they could. And in that way, you know, you feel less alone. So.
Thanks for that. James, do you want to add anything on that issue, or shall we move along?
I'll just add really quickly, one of the things about working with movement elders, that being a movement author, you're in the same movement with people, so it's a very, very tricky relationship, because it's different than interviewing people and collecting their stories and gaining their trust is very different than showing up at a meeting with people or going to a rally with people. And honestly, most of the Bay Area people that we interviewed, I've known for quite some time. You know, many of them. But it's also about reckoning with power, because people share their stories, and they share many different parts of their stories. And as an author, you have the power to decide what to emphasize, what to put in the background, what to take out of the story altogether. So it's really about reckoning with that, and taking responsibility for that. But also, one of the touching things for me is that, you know, people have changed the way that they approach to politics, but nobody that we interviewed has sold out or given up. They're truly the undefeated veterans of our movement that have made lifetime commitments to fighting racism and fascism and supporting Black liberation. They're almost all there, right? You know, some of them are doing things that they never thought they would ever do today, like voting or whatnot. Some of them are active in much more, you know, reform work, everything, which is different than what they were involved with at the time. But none of them has given up or given in, and it's quite inspiring.
So James, one of the things that you all make a pretty intentional point of throughout the book is you continue to reference the tight relationship between the committee and the prisoners' rights movement. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why those two sets of work were so connected, and what's instructive about that relationship for contemporary organizers.
Well, as Hilary pointed out, you know, the origins of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee comes from doing prisoner support in upstate New York. So their life is very much tied to the expense of the prison industrial complex. You know, what some terms you know, mass incarceration, but you know, they're witnessing it, and they're witnessing it on two levels. One is watching political prisoners go inside, people that they had known for many years, you know, long after, you know, after 1977, like, you know, Oscar Rivera, and and many others, but then also coming to a deeper sense of how the lines between social prisoner and a political prisoner can be really thin at many times. Almost all all individual cases of incarceration have political aspects, right? And there's certainly a spectrum there, but almost all have political implications and political choices and political power behind them, which I'm sure is not that statement is not a surprise to any of your CPE listeners, of course. So you see a continuation of work that had and thought and analysis that reaches back to the late 60s and early 70s, and you see a lot of the work feeding into work that was being done by others, fed into to that the current day abolitionist movement. So it's a really really specific point, historical point where the left was really starting to develop an analysis, or continue analysis rather, so they didn't make it up by anything, of of the implications of locking so many people up and putting so many human beings behind cages, whether they were locked up for shoplifting, or locked up for suspicion of being involved with militant actions.
By way of following up on that, James, one of the other kind of elements that you all draw out is AIDS activism and some of the relationship between like organizations such as like ACT UP, for instance, but also the kind of amount of AIDS education and activism that was happening by imprisoned people that had some kind of relationship to the John Brown Anti-Klan committee. Can you talk a little bit about that as well, that kind of relationship?
Well, certainly the incarceration of so many organizers, activists, and revolutionaries roughly overlapped with the growth of the AIDS crisis. People going into into prisons where there was hardly any support, any type of prevention, treatment, even just even humanitarian relief for what people were going through. So we see people, and this is throughout the New Left, not just the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. We see David Gilbert doing groundbreaking work around debunking AIDS conspiracy theory. We see Linda Evans working with allies on the outside to capture old comic books, the dykes to watch out for comic books, and whiting out the dialogue and putting AIDS prevention tips into it and smuggling them back into prisons. And you see this AIDS activism happening all across the country through all sorts of New Left people who are imprisoned. And I think that's something that a historian really needs to pick up on, and I'm glad that we opened up this space in our book to talk about it. It's not enough. It's certainly not enough when we hear about these different events that led folks to prison. We oftentimes are treated to the most sensationalistic true crime treatments, but people aren't, not enough work has been done on the ways that people applied their values behind and their politics behind bars in some of the most dire situations.
Thanks for drawing those connections. I think that's really important stuff for people to be aware of, and I think you do an excellent job, the two of you, in the book, and kind of elevating that work, that shared work. Hilary, the book's final chapter is called Lessons for Today's Movements, and I want to acknowledge that you all wrote the book before this year's uprisings, and before, the most recent uptick in racist and authoritarian violence that we've been seeing that's been associated with the protest against the COVID-19 public health restrictions or in support of the Trump presidential campaign, just for instance. And I'm wondering if you could, bearing these kind of newer developments in mind, articulate what you think are some of the lessons that are particularly important for contemporary organizers to learn from the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's some lessons that are quite timeless that are, of course, in this book, but you could find in many other books, any other movement history books. And I think, classic is like broad solidarity and genuine strategic solidarity built on genuine relationships. Knowing that, like we kind of chart out, like, why is it that the John Brown crew, through decades, and even if they are no longer in the same organization, like how is it that they still remain quite close, or still are committed to supporting political prisoners, or still are committed to, ending state repression in all these different movements. And one of those pieces being like, and knowing that our political relationships are not just something you do in the pastime, but like can be a way of life and can be a way of survival and necessary survival. And how they did that, I think is interesting. People choosing to live together, people having families together, people making decisions, political decisions about where they want to go next for the next project based on shared assessment with other organizations about what's most needed where. And so I think one of the most important lessons of the organization in the book is like, given our political priorities, what's the question that we need to be continually asking ourselves so that we can stay flexible, that we can stay connected even if, there's distance or space between us, and what helps us feel connected to something much bigger than ourselves and for a positive future. And especially in COVID, especially given the list, that we're up against, the litany of all of that, those are skills that we need to get more practice in, and then also feel how the movements behind us or the movements before us have done that and learn from them, so we don't have to recreate wheels, we can learn from them.
James, do you want to add anything to that list of lessons?
Yeah, I mean, ironically, I think the lessons part was the part that I struggled with the most when our publisher came back to us and said we kind of want a chapter with bullet point lessons. And I think in my heart of hearts, I really just wanted to tell the story and let groups of organizers and activists read it and draw their own conclusions. But one of the lessons that I really took to heart was just the politics of solidarity around the grand juries. I definitely got from interviewing many people who resisted grand juries that at that point when the FBI knocked on the door, they might not have agreed 100% with the people that they were being asked to testify against at that point. Right? There may have been some severe disagreements with her. Who knows? But I definitely got a little bit of that feeling. But it didn't matter, right? They just refused to testify. They're like, this is my friend, this is my comrade. I'm not giving the state anything on there. And people like Terry Bisson did some time behind that, and I think and many others, many others, not just John Brown members, but many people who were getting the subpoenas. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of that type of activity in the coming years, whether or not Trump or Biden wins. I think that Biden's FBI is going to behave a lot like Trump's FBI, around on these specific issues. Maybe not as vicious, maybe not as widespread, but certainly we're going to be dealing with that. So yeah, I think that I always refer back when we talk about disagreements in the movement around tactics. I always think about the pacifist Henry David Thoreau penning the essay in defense of Captain John Brown, who certainly was not a pacifist by any stretch of the imagination. He stood up for him anyhow.
Wonderful. Thank you both for that. Now I get to what I think is just the hardest question, probably, that I ever ask anybody in these sessions. But I'm going to ask each of you to respond. So, James, I'm going to start with you and then Hilary, move to you. I'm wondering if you can share with us what is your favorite part of the book, or one part that you think is particularly useful in this present period for people, particularly organizers and activists who might pick it up.
My favorite part and the most useful part, and what's useful will change during, as time goes by, even week by week. My favorite part is chapter 4. I love talking about the history of of a very different type of culture war around the work that John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and many others in the 80s did to blunt the fascist takeover of the punk rock scene and other countercultural music scenes. It's really inspiring. I don't think we can win these type of things, without an aspect of culture and cultural activism, cultural organizing rather. And yeah, it also gave me a chance to read, write, and talk to a lot of musical heroes. However, I think the most useful one is the one that Hilary really took the lead on, was chapter 2, talking about the rise of Reagan, the parallels to what we've seen today and what we are likely to see again in future years. I think are it's extremely useful. Unfortunately, I would like us to get to the point one day where we read books like this and we're like, well, that was an interesting time. Great. It would be, it doesn't have any bearing on our lives anymore, right? But we're not there yet, and we're not going to be there anytime soon.
Hilary, how about for you?
Yeah. I think it totally is reflective, as well as like who we got to be in the room with and have the conversations with. So I'm pretty partial to the Austin chapter and the crew and how that chapter emerged. I think the story there of, lesbian separatists, would-be members of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee coming out of the woods of Arkansas because racist ass shit was going on, and the projects that they were part of lesbian separatism was no longer what they thought was politically relevant, or the most relevant thing they could do was to come back into movement, to join multiracial coalitions, to fight the Klan and other Klan-like groups. And so to me, that's quite inspiring in terms of like, okay, shifting your personal life conditions to take care of a political commitment that you have. And I also appreciate what within that story, how the John Brown members renegotiated what self-defense was, and what is liberatory self-defense, and what is self-defense, a feminist self-defense, and what is self-defense that takes care of movements for self-determination, and how that is a very different narrative than a self-defense of that gets deployed by the right. And it was definitely in circulation of the Klan and white rights, defending white rights. So I think that that's a tricky narrative for today still, who gets to defend themselves and from whom and how. And I think chapter 2 is an important investigation of just a liberatory self-defense. And I guess I'll throw it back to James. I think some of the cultural organizing piece around music, right? Like what mobilizes people, what speaks to them, what gives them a positive future. Like, goddamn, we need a positive future right now. And whether that's through cultural organizing, through music, through all the ways that we still can keep connection to each other. Like, and it's all the more precious, our ability to like move our hearts and minds together towards something that is actually hopeful or promising, or just keeps us going in this moment.
Excellent. There's so many good portions of the book to choose from, but I appreciate you both directing us to some specific things. And by way of kind of closing out, the Center for Political Education is deeply influenced by the great Amilcar Cabral, who reminds us to never stop learning. So at each turn, we always try to figure out what can we scaffold each thing that we're learning with additionally so that we can continue our educations moving forward. So I'm wondering if each of you, Hilary, I'll start with you, wondering if each of you could recommend a thing or two that might be a good complement or supplement to the book if people are trying to take it up. What's like a good partner for this book in this period?
Yeah. The best thing about writing a book like this is all the conversations that get to come after. So I think some good pairs are like go to freedomarchives.org and click the button or the movie that's called COINTELPRO 101. So especially for white anti-racist activists who are newly mobilized or still trying to find some footing in this political moment, just getting a sense for what our movements have been up against and who gets targeted and how, and what are some of those components. I feel like that context is a huge foundation for what our book sits upon. And then related, I would say go to collectiveliberation.org, which is Catalyst Project's website, which is an anti-racist political education project, kind of building out white anti-racism grassroots struggles. And they have a brochure that's very much meant for people in motion, people in groups, and it's called a Troublemaker's Guide, Principles for Racial Justice Activists in the Face of State Repression. And it kind of walks you through like what the principles are for keeping your members safe, but also, what you doing, James? Like keeping our movement safe and working with each other. So COINTELPRO 101 with Freedom Archives, Troublemaker's Guide on Catalyst Project's website.
All right, James, you find something while you were looking around there?
Yeah, I was trying to find a book but I won't flash it up. I'm surrounded by books, a potential avalanche of books one day, living so close to the fault lines here. I've been going on a kind of a binge reading of going back and reading Robin D.G. Kelley's work, which is constantly inspiring and constantly has some kind of clue from history or analysis that you can use in your everyday organizing. I've been really enjoying Jane McAlevy's work a lot, because just the back to basics organizing, reestablishing the idea that the revolution happens face to face. And honestly, I think that people should, if you have access to HBO, you should really be watching Lovecraft Country right now. I think it's one of the most subversive things in the world, in the world, in the way that we approach both the past and potential futures.
I couldn't have picked better myself. You all picked excellent partners for this excellent book. So this is the book, No Fascist USA. Learn about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. Get this book. And as I always say, more importantly than getting it, read this book and put it to work. And James and Hilary, thank you so much for joining us today for CPE Study Hall.